Beam's unique features, I find this like more interesting. They have a concept of like an audible wallet. So imagine like a Monero, when you have a transaction, you have a view key. So audible wallet is effectively a view, you can see it as a view key for Beam. However, this must be enabled by the end user. So if you don't enable audible wallet, no one will be able to infer that you've had transactions or not. Beam also has a unique feature to reduce the number of like kernel transactions, which reduces chain state. And then Beam's approach for sending messages securely is something they call the secure bulletin board system, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like a bulletin board that everyone posts to, which seems kind of odd. So there's like this shared message board where people just put encrypted messages on, and people will try to decrypt these messages, which in my opinion seems really inefficient. But if it's all in one place, like maybe you can't do like network analysis on like where the messages are propagating and going. So like it sort of works-ish. And then there's like some like miscellaneous differences that we probably should explore because this will affect not necessarily privacy. And I think over time we've realized like it's more than just the privacy primitives that a protocol implements that really determines its success. Like we need to understand like what is like the monetary policy, what is like the governance, what does the community believe, like what does the mining environment look like, what is like the technical nuances, like what are the directions that the team's going. Like for example, Grin is really weird where Grin did not have Grin did not raise external funding. They just took donations, whereas like Beam raised like venture capital and money from private investors. So Grin's like, okay, we have like no money, and investors are like, okay, we really want to get exposure to Grin, but we can't give them money, so what can we do? Because we can't donate money, because we can't get anything from that. So instead, we're going to invest in like mining pools specifically for Grin. So you have a bunch of investors who's like dumped the money into SPV mining, special purpose vehicles for mining, which is how they got exposure to it. It's like, okay, that's kind of a really roundabout way to get, like Grin coins. Like maybe Beam is more efficient from raising like external capital and having those people get a proportion of the founder's reward, like Zcash. So these are just like political differences and like that both protocols kind of made. And when I think of Grin versus Beam, I kind of think of Monero versus Zcash, right? Because like Monero took no outside money, whereas like Zcash sold a portion of the founder's reward, which could be problematic, who knows. And then supply side, like Grin is similar to Monero where you have like linear, like infinite tail inflation. But Grin actually has a very high inflation rate in the beginning and slowly tapers off and like approaches zero as time goes on. Beam has like a fixed supply, like whether this matters in the short term or long term, who knows? But there's just some like ideological differences. Like Beam also has a halving, and some people believe halvings are very unstable for prices near the halving period, whereas Grin doesn't have this, so maybe Grin is more stable. Like, who knows? We don't really know. They also use like different databases for the transactions. Grin actually used RocksDB, but then they realized LMDB was better, which is awesome because what Monero uses. Beam uses like SQLite. It probably doesn't really matter. Like both these databases are very similar and probably doesn't affect the protocol that much. Like the mempool representation of data, it's like, okay, they're both different ways of doing it, but it probably doesn't make much of a difference, especially in terms of privacy. So the question is like, which protocols succeed? Like they're both the same Mimblewimble protocol. They all have the baseline of like privacy guarantees, but because they have different monetary policy, like mining, like in practice the mining pools are very different, and they have these like technical nuances, like okay, like which one will be more likely to be successful, and which one will win long term, and like we don't really know. You can make a guess, you can compare like Zcash and Monero and like work backwards from there, but who knows? And I like to put a shameless plug. If you want to like learn more about this content that our research team did, go to tlu.tari.com. This is Tari Labs University, and this is where our research team puts all their stuff. So if you have any questions, like feel free to ask. We're done now. Yes. One more time. So how does Alice identify Bob? This is great. So in order to find your counterparty you're transacting with, you actually need to do it out of band. So And so in Beam, you'll be like, okay, this is my private public key pair, and you like send it to like Alice, like, hey, like this is my public key, like encrypt the message, encrypt it. Sorry, like encrypt your message to my public key. Grin doesn't really have any like standard way of doing it, so you have to do it all out of band. Like maybe this is okay. Like if you're like like transacting over like secure messenger, you're like, okay, this is my public key, like just encrypt it to this and like send the information over this channel. But unless they have like like a unified like one way of doing it, there's a lot of issues where you can have leakage or like cement in the middle of attack. So this is problematic, especially given that Grin doesn't have a standard way of doing it. That is not an area of my expertise, but I can link you later. It may not be true. I misread when I was really tired working at this at 4 a.m. Perfect. Thank you.
Coming talk that we got is given by Reuben. Last name is in here, and I'm going to open this up. Reuben Yap. And he's going to be talking with us about Zcoin. Coming up next, after this, he is going to have a table set aside for him, one of these two tables, and you can find him here to ask questions and do whatever he has planned for his little workshop here. Kind of after that, we got Cathie, who's going to be walking us through Bulletproofs. And then we got Kristy-Leigh Minehan from Core Scientific, who's going to be talking with us about the future of accessible mining. And then last, we're going to have me on the stage again, just saying thank you to absolutely everybody who was a part of this. And you don't have to come to that one. I won't be offended. So we're looking to get started on this in about 3 minutes. And we are on time this time and set up beforehand. So this talk will happen right on time. Yay! Yay! This guy. All right, man, here you go.
Okay, hang on, let me...
Hey, let's keep the volume down, yeah?
Okay, hello everyone, my name is Reuben, I'm from the Zcoin team, and today we're going to be talking about basically how we handle broken cryptography in cryptocurrencies and some of the challenges and lessons we learned from the catastrophic flaw that was Zcoin. So just a bit about ourselves. How does this work? So we are a privacy coin that actually launched on mainnet in September 2016, and we actually pioneered the practical use of Zcoin, which is actually different than Zero Cash. And it was actually one of the earlier kind of a privacy protocols to actually introduce the burn and redeem mechanism. We're currently using a different privacy protocol that we replaced after Zcoin called Sigma, and we are currently working on something called Lelantus, which is also being considered by MRL as a possible scaling solution for Monero. We have a team of about 19 people, which almost more than half are developers, and 2 researchers, 1 which is here, and 6 who are involved in operations, including me. We're working all around the world, and most of us are full-time. So the thing about dealing with bugs in cryptocurrencies are particularly difficult. And the more that you resemble a true cryptocurrency, the more difficult it is to actually deal with it. Like, for example, the first thing is the decentralized nature of these networks. And like, for example, if you have an app in App Store and there's a bug, you can just like push out an update and everyone updates, right? But the key point of blockchain networks, decentralized networks, is that you cannot force people to upgrade. They only upgrade if they want to. And what happens is that, let's say if you cannot just turn on a fix. You need everyone to agree and a date for that kind of fix to turn on. And it's about convincing not just your users, but the pools, the exchanges, to actually update urgently without actually causing panic. It's really important not to cause panic, especially in a cryptocurrency. Now, one of also the biggest challenges of open source software is that actually every single release has to be accompanied with the associated code. Meaning that, say, when I'm fixing the bug, the fix to the bug will have to be committed to GitHub before I can make a release. And that's a real problem, because by committing the fix, I'm telling everyone about the flaw. And that's also a real issue there. The third one is also really bad. It's really hard, because let's say if you suffer from damage, if like coins are being created out of thin air, those coins are sent to exchanges and bought by innocent people. It is very difficult to say roll back the damage per se, because you have innocent people holding the coins. And we don't want to have another like Ethereum and Ethereum Classic type of situation. So many times you cannot just undo the damage, and most of the time damage is permanent. So what are cryptographic flaws? We have to sort of distinguish them from, let's say, software implementation flaws. And a cryptographic flaw is a flaw that happens in the actual mathematics of it. It's not just a software bug in the code, but actually sort of like there's a problem with the building block. And there's been actually many sort of implementation and software bugs, even in Bitcoin. There's been a Bitcoin value overflow incident where over 184 billion coins were created out of thin air. That was a software implementation bug. There was in Stellar. Zcoin also suffered it really early on, which was also really bad. PIVX also suffered it as well. And all of these are just pure software implementation bugs. They don't actually go down to the problems in the mathematics. Now, these are some of the examples of what cryptographic flaws, and it tends to happen a lot more to privacy coins because of the, we use like cryptographic mixing or methods. And there was a Zcash counterfeiting vulnerability that was actually live for 2 years since inception, and no one actually really knows right now whether it has been exploited or not. In Monero had an inflation bug that thankfully was never exploited, and they could actually tell that there was no sort of counterfeit coins being created. And Zcoin, the one that we are talking about today, there was a huge zero coin inflation bug in April 2019, and it was actually resulting from a failure in one of the zero knowledge proofs. It actually created about 67,000 coins out of thin air. Luckily, that's less than 1% of circulating supply. Our current supply is about like 8 million or so now. But it's still something that we cannot like retroactively fix. So just a quick understanding for those of you who are not familiar with Zerocoin. Zerocoin is a privacy protocol that allows you to mint, which is the destruction of the coin, and then the spend, which is the redemption of brand new coins with no previous transaction history. So it was actually like the first application of zero knowledge proofs that used this sort of burn and spend mechanism to provide privacy. And when you sort of compare it to other type of privacy mechanisms like coin join or ring signatures and coin join, they're kind of like obfuscating transaction links, so hiding in the crowd. And Zerocoin attempts to try to break the transaction links between the coins because the brand new coins don't have any transaction links to the previous burn. And there were numerous problems with Zerocoin, and we probably should have looked into it a lot harder. And the original Zerocoin paper was written by Ian Mears, Kristen Garman, and Matthew Green, which then also wrote the Zero Cash paper, which now is the foundation of Zcash. And we were like, when Zcoin first started, we only had one programmer. We started it. It was like an experiment. And we trusted that these people were like the top cryptographers, one of the top cryptographers in the world. And we kind of trusted it. And that was one of the fatal problems that we had. It was actually rather cryptically written, and certain constructions of the proof, that means it wasn't actually fully described. It was only described in the software library that they created. And that's a big problem because then, it's a very different thing than, let's say, I'm reading through the paper and understand how it all works, rather than going through the individual crypto analysis to actually tell, well, does this whole scheme actually work? There's actually no single paper exactly describing the way Zcoin is implemented in the library, and it requires wading through bits and pieces of other papers here and there. And it's not as if we didn't take a look at it. We actually engaged a cryptographer, Tim Ruffing, to actually try to find flaws in our implementation in the Zcoin security model, and we actually did find 2 of them. Which was that allowed an attacker to to destroy coins of honest users while in transit, and an attacker can actually hijack redemptions. Let's say if someone creates coins to redeem it to themselves, those coins can be redirected to someone else. However, we will talk about this later. It isn't as serious as it seems to be, because to actually pull off this attack successfully, you would actually need to have control of the hash power, it's more than 51%, and also control of the network to be able to selectively censor transactions. If you're going to control both of this, you have kind of effective control of the network. But we'll talk about a bit more about that later. Now, on April 9th, which was Zcoin, which is the protocol, was hacked, and due to a flawed proof, and coins were actually created out of thin air. And this vulnerability actually impacted all projects utilizing Zcoin, not just us. But we were the only ones that were hacked. So just kind of like a timeline of the attack. We actually noticed a spike in Zcoin anonymization transactions. We do monitor the network just to sort of as a safeguard. And usually, typically, the problem with privacy opt-in is that generally the take-up of such transactions are quite low. And suddenly you're seeing every single block with max number of Zcoin anonymization transactions. And we were starting to wonder what was happening here. What happened actually was at one point the spends, the redemptions exceeded the burns. And we knew something was definitely not right there. I mean, that's supposed to not to happen. And we were actually kind of really stressed. Obviously, we didn't even know where the flaw was, but we knew that something was wrong. We immediately contacted the mining pools that we know to inform them to request disabling of Zcoin spans. That's not done at a consensus layer. That's a parameter that pools can choose how many Zcoin spans they want to process per block. And we told them, look, we are actually investigating certain Zcoin irregularities. Can you please reduce this to 0 while we investigate it? Luckily, most of them did, but there were still some unknown pools continued processing. So this hack was continuing to happen, and we couldn't really stop it because of its decentralized nature. We actually did inform other major projects utilizing Zcoin of a possible issue. We say, look, there's something that's not right here. We noticed more spends than mints. We don't know if you guys are affected, but maybe let's create a working group to see, if we can find a solution here. On the 16th of April, because we had actually disabled Zcoin spends without telling the whole public, but it was already too long. It was already 1 week ahead, and people were starting to complain, why can't I process my Zcoin spends? And we had to come up with a public notice that we had asked the pools to disable Zcoin spends while investigating the irregularities. Now, after 3 days, or actually it's already 10 days since we discovered the hack, we finally discovered the root cause of the flaw, and he confirmed that it was actually a cryptographic flaw in one of the proofs, and this was discovered by our own lead developer, Peter Sugarleff. We did a limited disclosure to the Zcoin working group to tell people that, hey, this is something that we know is definitely something is wrong. We think that everyone's affected, but we didn't want to tell the exact problem yet because we didn't want to give ammunition for these other coins to potentially attack us as well. But we just wanted to tell them, look, the problem is real. Maybe you want to start looking at it. We are in the midst of patching it, but you might want to keep Zcoin disabled, because at that point in time, other projects such as Pivex had already disabled their Zcoin protocol. Prior to this hack happening, they were vulnerable to a different software implementation problem called RAP serious attack, and they had disabled their Zcoin, and we were telling them, keep it disabled for now. They were actually planning to reactivate it, and we told them, look, since you have it disabled, just keep it disabled for a little while longer while we figure out what's happening here, and I think that's what they did. on the 20th of April, the hacker, wrote a little gloating email to us like, hey, did you know how I do it? We didn't really engage with him too much, just kept him. He actually offered to work for us for security audit, but we didn't really engage with him so much. Yeah. So on the 24th of April, we actually released an emergency software update, which actually disabled zero coins at the consensus layer. Because remember, we only disabled it at the mining pool level, and it was still spans getting through in those blocks. And we only had a two-day window. And we're kind of lucky that we're kind of a small coin, so it's relatively easy to do this now. This is something that we may not be able to replicate in the future as we grow bigger. And once the hard fork came into being, the attack actually completely stopped, and we knew that the total number of damage was 69,000 coins. And the only reason why we knew about the exact amount of damage is that actually if you knew the exact flaw in Zcoin, you could actually create perfect forgeries. But because the attacker didn't quite understand it, he just kind of like got a symptom of it. And the spans that he created had a certain signature. It was slightly inflated in size. And that's why we know there were 69,000 coins being created. Now, what actually happened was when this happened, we did inform the working group. One project actually kind of jumped the gun. I don't know what, for whatever reason, they gone and made their disclosure first before we did, and said that, oh, we are not affected, we are immune. Zcoin is disabled on our network. And that was, to put it to say the least, a bit of a dick move, because other projects had not secured themselves. Other projects did not have a mechanism to just disable Zcoin like that. And this was a real big problem for us, because although we had already secured ourselves, all these other projects that were still using Zcoin did not have a clear way to disable it very quickly. And this actually required us to come up with a different, like a quick disclosure to say, okay, this is what's happening. We're not going to tell you the exact details, but we'll let you know, let you guys know later. But this was one of the real problems that really kind of hit us really badly. Now, on the 30th of April, luckily, all projects that we were aware of had disabled Zcoin either via Spox or hard fork. And Spox is kind of like, for those that are using the Dash master code, they can actually have a sort of a development master key that can turn off and turn on certain features. So for those coins, they had an easy time. The dev just turned it off, which is great for stopping a hack, not so great for decentralization. And we made a full disclosure of the cryptographic vulnerability, and made it public. And after that, about 2 months later, we finally deployed our replacement privacy protocol that we actually have been developing since early 2018. So it was actually in the plan anyway to replace Zcoin. So what actually did we learn from the incident? And we think there are actually 3 key pillars in dealing with cryptographic flaws, which is capability, communication, and caution. And the first thing is that no one wants to deal with other people's shit, okay, especially if on an urgent basis. When a cryptographic flaw happens, you have to act really quickly. And we tried looking for help, just in case we couldn't solve it ourselves. We were really worried this could potentially kill the coin. And we reached out, even to the original researchers. Everyone was like, oh, we're busy, and didn't really want to touch this problem because it was a real big problem. And I think that's actually a really key differentiator between projects that merely just implement other people's privacy protocols versus those that actually develop it themselves. Like, for example, with Zcash, there's so many other privacy projects that use a Zcash privacy protocol, or similarly, there's a lot of projects that use Monero privacy protocol. And sure, they may get how it works, but they don't really know the inner workings. And that's really dangerous, because that means they're reliant on whatever the parent project is to make disclosures to them. And sometimes that doesn't really work, as we'll see later. And sometimes you really cannot trust everybody. We'll talk about this a bit later, but even cryptographers you engage as a third party can actually screw you over as well, especially if they're just a contractor as well. They can exploit it themselves, or they can publish an academic paper and blow it up out of all proportions and gain credit from themselves, which we'll actually see what actually happened with the burning Zcoins for fun and profit paper, actually. Now, disclosure and working together with other projects in competition is very risky, even though, like, we were all incentivized to fix Zerocoin. I don't know, our experience with this whole Zerocoin working group was so bad that we were thinking, like, in the future, we might not even collaborate, which is very sad, but it's, maybe you guys, but, there was a real, like, breach of trust on our head. So you have to carry your own shit. So communications, we have, the several people that we need to talk to, the community, media, PR, our infrastructure, and the code itself. And through the community, of course, we need to try to be as honest as possible to let people know that there's a problem. But again, we have to stagger the information release while we fix the problem and, totally sort of lock it down. And we also need to make sure that we're not causing a panic, like, oh my God, there's all this speculation on what the thing might be, which actually would really affect the trust in your project. Now, with the thing that's really important is the engagement of media and PR. When something goes wrong, you really need to be proactive, not just reactive. And we made a mistake before where we kind of just reacted to the problem. And in this particular case, when we knew we had the problem, we straight away reached out to all the media. This is our official press release. This is what it is. If you have any questions, talk to us. And we were really wanting to make sure that you got the portrayal of the bug correctly. Now, just to give an example of something that went really wrong. So remember those 2 bugs that we found previously that were not that critical, which was called burning Zerocoins for fun and profit. That researcher actually approached all these media and said, like, I found a critical flaw in Zerocoin. And the problem was that we had engaged him to actually find this flaw, and we had actually patched it, which was actually scheduled for activation. And what has happened was, all the news was saying, critical flaw in Zerocoin, this thing can't be fixed. And actually, as I mentioned later, it is actually really difficult to take advantage of that flaw. So it's really important to just proactively reach out instead of waiting for people to crap at you. Now, with the infrastructure, of course, it's always good, although we are decentralized projects, we should be knowing who our main stakeholders are, especially the exchanges, the mining pools. And we have to make sure we open good enough communications with that so that when we tell them, hey, disable Zerocoin, or this emergency update, at least, they trust us enough to take it at our word. It's not the best thing, but we need to build that relationship up there. And the worst thing, I guess, is through the code. We need to communicate through the code. Remember, every single sort of fix that we put has to be committed to the source code before we can actually make a release. And one way to do it, there are, I guess, 2 approaches to do it. One, which is the Zcash way, which is basically wait for a huge update and then sort of sneak the fix in. There are certain drawbacks to that because that means you may be open for attack for a much longer period. Or for us, what we did, we kind of downplay the fix. So for example, even Bitcoin did that when they had an inflation bug. They said, oh, this bug, we fixed the bug that solved DDoS, but then actually it also solves an inflation bug. So what we did was to downplay the fix, and when we committed the code to GitHub so that it doesn't result in any sort of panic. But later on, we of course fully disclose as well. So the last one, I guess, is caution. Don't trust, verify, even if it's done by the world's best cryptographers or whatnot. As I said, understanding a protocol is quite different than doing a detailed analysis of it. And the Zerocoin flaw was actually quite tricky to find. I mean, the protocol has been around for a long time. We kind of assume, people have looked at it. We had cryptographers from different projects looking at it, and no one saw it. Everyone thought it was okay, right? And unless you actually pointed it and stared at it, I'm like, oh yeah, there's something wrong there. So it pays to actually really, analyze every single portion of it. Now, don't be in a rush to deploy new technology, especially when it seems much better. I think this is something we have been guilty of. Like, for example, our proof of work algorithm called MTP. There was a new paper out that promised to be better than Equihash, more fair and everything, and what happened. And we spent about 8 to 10 months kind of trying to work this out and develop it. And about 2 weeks before launch, there was actually a paper out that said, oh, MTP is broken, you can attack it in this way. And can you imagine, like, we just threw like one whole year's worth of work, so we had to actually invest in more research to actually fix it. Took another year to, you know, get that paper out and deploy a fix. And I think it's better to actually, rather than, you know, keep on looking at the new shiny things, to wait for the technology to mature before you launch it to the main. I mean, it seems really obvious now, but, you know, when it was like a very competitive environment, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's quite tempting to take on the most like sexy technology. The other thing I would say is like consider using circuit breakers or limiters that can be slowly relaxed. So for example, in Zcoin, we actually had a limit of, let's say, like 500 Zcoin per block that could be spent. It's almost like similar to almost like like Bitcoin having like a 1 megabyte block limit to prevent DOS attacks. I think it's quite, especially when you're dealing with like such a new technology, it's probably wise to have some sort of you know, like limiters in place, and I guess that actually saved us because of that block. We could limit the damage. It couldn't just like create like 1 billion coins out of thin air. But it's not ideal, and it has to be, you know, it's just one of the many fixes that you could do. But we have to be very, very careful that we are not introducing centralization. Like, I'm actually personally really against sports because, you know, it's basically the developer who has the key to be able to turn off and turn on functionality. And I think especially as a privacy coin, that's horrible if a dev can, if like a law enforcement or like, you know, government state entity goes to the dev and turn off privacy. I think that's a horrible idea. Okay. So just quickly, what replaced Zerocoin? We are currently on Sigma, which is based out of much better written papers. You know, every single, like the construction is relatively simple, and every single portion has a security proof. And it works exactly like Zerocoin, except it uses different cryptography, and it's a lot smaller. It has really small proof sizes, and it also does not have trusted setup. So this is already currently deployed on our network, and is live since like the end of July. Lelantus, which some of you may have already heard, it further expands on Sigma, and it eliminates the need for burning and redemption in fixed denominations by actually hiding amounts as well. We also have the ability to have direct anonymous payments. That means you don't have to keep on redeeming back to the base layer, but it requires a self-span, and it's a problem that we're working on. And it's also you know, a problem that if Lelantus is to be ever considered to be deployed in Monero, this is a problem that needs to be solved. So Monero's proposed use of Lelantus is kind of different than how Zcoin intends to use it. So I think Monero's, if I'm correct, you know, intends to build like very large rings, like 1,000 or so. The way Lelantus in Zcoin's intending to be used is as like a sort of like a similar type as Zerocoin, where we're doing burning and redemption. So it's different approaches, but possibly using the same technology. So just a quick comparison. I actually spoke to Aram. There's a bit of errors in some of the proof sizes. So, you know, this is just a sort of like overview of the different, you know, privacy mechanisms. So as you can see, Monero actually solves most of the issues except with the anonymity set size, which is something that is on active research. The thing that needs to be corrected is that in Lelantus and Sigma, the proof sizes, when you are dealing with all the proofs, including the auxiliary proofs, the range proofs, is about 3 to 4 kilobytes. You can ask Aram later. So it's about similar to Monero, and I think everything else is relatively correct. And you can take a look how bad Zerocoin is when comparing all this other stuff. All right. So yeah, I mean, you can find out more. You know, we have a very active Telegram community. If you want to find out more about Lelantus, you can go to that website, and we have a Zcoin table later on, have a website. So yeah, I'll take some questions if anyone has them. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, yes, sir. It's already deployed, yeah. Yeah, so right now, I mean, originally we did think about like having Lelantus on testnet and maybe in like Q1 2020. But I don't know, after this incident, we're like, maybe we should slow down a bit, and that may be a wise choice. But we do have the cryptographic libraries, as you already know, and hopefully, we can share some of that as well. But right now, I would say that we're kind of like patting down Sigma, making sure everything is like, fine and dandy, and we'll also be doing mobile development. But then, I think maybe in 1 or 2 months' time, the relentless development really start kicking in. So that's kind of where we are. Yeah. Yeah, we already in great touch with Sarang, and we're really open. We actually agreed privately that we may actually share our source code of what we've done to Sarang early on before even making it open source. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Reuben. Let's give him another round of applause. We finished that talk with a little bit of time to spare, so we're going to go ahead and get set up with our next talk. That's Cathie over here. She just walked in the door. She's the superstar of the day, going to be talking about Bulletproofs. So we're going to get her set up. That is at, say again? 11:45. So we got about 15 minutes. Feel free to mill about. Workshop over here, Zcoin workshop is going to be taking place on one of these tables if you want to talk more. Reuben, what will you be doing in this workshop? He's going to be shilling. Okay, so if you want to be shilled to, please go to one of these tables, follow him over there, and badger him for all the questions that you want answered about Zcoin. We also, once again, paid merch back there. If you haven't bought it, you're a bad person. So support the Monero project and buy some paid merch back there. 8 books left, guys. Come on. I don't want to take any of those home with me. Cathie Yun, who is going to give us a deep dive into bulletproofs. Now, if you are a swimmer, you may be familiar with diving deep, but diving into mathematics is it's a lot different, and you come out just as exhausted, but it's a different form of exhaustion. So Cathie here is going to very gently take us through bulletproofs, and I hope you all come out the other side smarter, because all of this is going to go over my head. Cathie, please be gentle.
I'll use my lapel. Cool, you need to turn this off. Cool. Hi, all right, I'm Cathie. For some context, I worked on an implementation of bulletproofs in Rust, both at Chain and Interstellar. And we have the fastest implementation in existence, and so I feel like maybe that makes me qualified to just tell you a little bit about how bulletproofs works. So maybe before I begin, there's a lot of stuff that I can cover, and what I cover is largely determined by what you guys want to hear. So what I submitted to this talk was, let's go really deep into the math of bulletproofs. We can do that. We can also do less of that and talk more about the things we built on top of bulletproofs, what other people can use it for, maybe proposals of what Monero might be able to do. So maybe by a show of hands, how many people are here because they really want to just get deep in the math? Oh, okay, cool. Let's do that. And then if we have extra time afterwards, I'm happy to sort of talk about other extensions over that. Awesome. So the motivation of why we care about bulletproofs. First, I guess we should talk about why we care about zero-knowledge proofs. So for some of you, this might be redundant, but I'll just cover some basic ground first. So a zero-knowledge proof is a way to make a proof about, a proof that a statement is true about some input without revealing what that input is. So that might be a little confusing and abstract. One example of a zero-knowledge proof is a range proof. So a range proof is a proof that a certain number is in a range, usually 0 to 2 to the n, and you can show that this proof is true without revealing what your number is. So instead of revealing your number, your actual secret, you make a commitment to that number, and that commitment is binding and hiding, and you can show that commitment to someone without revealing your secret. So we'll talk a little bit more about range proofs, actually a lot more about range proofs, so don't be too intimidated yet. So probably a lot of things you're familiar with, but in a blockchain transaction that's non-confidential, this is what it looks like. And the important thing for validity of this transaction is that your inputs sum to the number that's equal to your outputs. So here you can visually check that 5 plus 4 equals 3 plus 6. You're not making any extra money out of thin air. And if you wanted to make this confidential, there's many ways to do this, but one proposed way is just called confidential transaction, proposed for Bitcoin. And a broken way to do this would be to use an additively homomorphic commitment and just say, well, now we're just going to do A, B, C, and D, which are blinding and hiding for our secret values. And then you just check that A plus B equals C plus D. And this will be true with very high probability if and only if your interior secret values actually sum up to the same value. Now, can anyone tell me why this is broken? Anyone? What's that? Yes? That is true. There's a very small chance that this can be incorrect, and this is because of the way that you have your commitment scheme, but that's such small probabilities that that's actually not something that we're going to worry about. What about you? Exactly, yeah. So this works on everything, but if you have a negative number, this also still works. And so this is still technically correct, but definitely not correct in the context of a blockchain financial transaction. So we don't want this to be possible. And for those of you who want to understand the math better, when I say a negative number, it's actually a negative number mod p, and so what this is basically equivalent to is an extremely large number in your prime order group, and so those two statements are equivalent. So you could be allowing someone to spend negative $1, or you can be allowing them to spend basically p minus 1, where p is very large. So that's just to be technically correct here. So what we want to do is to insert a proof, a range proof, that all of your secret values are in a certain range. So as long as your range proof is from 0 to a number that's still smaller than your prime order group p, then this will make sure that you don't add any like negative weird numbers. So yeah, that's one example of how zero-knowledge proofs are useful in the blockchain context. Obviously, there's many other ways to use them, and there's also many ways to use zero-knowledge proofs outside of blockchains too. But you're probably interested in the blockchain applications. And why do we care about Bulletproofs? So Bulletproofs is a pretty cool paper, came out in 2017 from Stanford, and it gives us a lot of properties that we really want in a blockchain context. So what we really want is a constrained proof size because all the nodes have to receive a proof and verify them. And Bulletproofs provides a pretty constrained proof size, O of log n, where n is the number of multipliers. It also gives us really fast verification. So that's important because, once again, you have to have all nodes sync up. And Bulletproofs provides fast verification that also allows you to batch, which means that you can verify multiple proofs in parallel more efficiently, and aggregate, which means you can combine multiple proofs into one proof that they are all correct. And then lastly, this is a really nice property and sort of a big differentiator from ZK snarks, for instance. You can have ad hoc logic that doesn't require trusted setup. So if you wanted to create a custom smart contract, for instance, you don't have to have a trusted reference string that requires your setup ceremony. So that is a big thing that is appealing about Bulletproofs and a big pain point of using ZK snarks. And I know a lot of like more recent zero-knowledge proof protocols, such as ZK sharks, which is great, the H is for hybrid, actually gives you a hybrid mode between Bulletproofs not requiring trusted setup and ZK snarks requiring trusted setup. So that's just like a fun side note. But basically at the time when we were looking to implement zero-knowledge proofs, Bulletproofs was the thing that definitely made the most sense. So what we wanted to do was, well, first of all, understand the paper, so we don't just blindly implement it. And then second, once we understood, then implement it using really best practices and existing libraries in Rust, and then make it really performant. So you're all here to hopefully understand the paper, so let's dive right in. This is what it feels like to read the paper. We have sort of some assumptions, for example, like we would like to prove that V is in range. And then it just gives us this like massive multiscalar multiplication, and you're like, what is going on? Oh my gosh. So I would like to hopefully give you a path between step 1 and step 2. So that's, and when we tried to figure that out, it took us actually like a month or two of just like whiteboarding out possible hypotheses of how we get from step 1 to step 2 and being like, no, that's wrong. No, that's still wrong. Okay, we actually like came up with something, and then we wrote up all of our notes online. So if you listen to this talk, you want more information, or maybe you listen to this talk and you're confused about some points, we actually have all of the notes for this online at docinternal.dolog.rs. Also, I will post the slides online too, so don't worry about finding all the URLs. And then, the last thing is that after we understood all of the math, Oleg went with his graphic genius and made a cyberpunk visual of how all of the math works. And so hopefully we can come back to the slide at the very end and you'll be like, oh, I understand all these transitions. That'll be really great. Well, most of them. Cool. So the most fundamental building block of Bulletproofs is this inner product argument. So this is actually not unique to Bulletproofs. This was introduced by a previous paper out of UCL. And Bulletproofs just made this 3 times more efficient. So what is an inner product? An inner product, for instance, C is the inner product of A and B, is the sum of the entry-wise multiplications of vectors A and B. So for some syntax in this slide and in the Bulletproofs paper, bolded letters represent vectors. So here C is the inner product of vector A and vector B. So naively, if you wanted to prove to me that C was equal to the inner product of A and B, and you had A and B, how could you do that? Like, just shout out some ideas, like super naively. How would you do this in like O of n space? Yeah, you could just send vector A, vector B, and scalar C to me, and then I as the verifier, could do the multiplication. So obviously this proof would be O of n space, because n is the length of A and B. The thing that Bulletproofs introduces is a way to do this in O of n time, O of n space. So what this looks like is first you start out with vectors A, B, and your scalar C. Then you split A and B into 2 halves. Then you take this random scalar, x, And right now, you don't have to worry about where x comes from. All you have to know is that it's not 0, because if it's 0, then you're like screwed. And it's totally random. Like you cannot predict it ahead of time. So you take this random scalar, x, and you multiply it by the first half of a, and you multiply the inverse by the second half of a, the second half of a. And then you get this a prime, and then you do a similar thing with b prime. And a prime and b prime are now half the length of a and b. And then you then get this like big mess for c prime. But actually, watch this. This is sort of magic. Because of the way that we selected the inverse and not inverse for a prime and b prime for x, we can actually simplify this mess of c prime to be equal to the inner product of a low and b low plus inner product of a high and b high plus like some garbage. And wait for it. The inner product of a low and b low plus the inner product of a high and b high is, by definition of inner product proof, the same thing as the inner product of a and b. So do you see like what's going on here? That line is actually the same thing as c above. Wow. Wait, okay, can you raise your hand if you like understood that, and if you don't, I can repeat, because I feel like this is a really critical part of the understanding. Okay, cool. Sort of. Okay, so yeah. Good, I'm getting to that. So first, we appreciate that the math works here so that you actually have C in your representation of C prime. And then you have this garbage. So this garbage, you actually just commit to it. So let's call the thing underlined in green L and the thing underlined in red R. And then we send those two, so they're two points. We send those 2 points to the verifier. And then you just say C prime is equal to the C from the previous round plus x squared plus times L plus x negative 2 times R. So in summary, this is one round. And in one round, what we have achieved is that we have half the size of A, half the size of B, and committed to 2 points. That's a constant number of points. So from like theory of computation, if you do a halving every step, and every step you do a constant number of commitments, then you have a protocol that takes O of log n space. Does everyone follow along so far? Okay, cool. So this is actually like the core nugget of what makes Bulletproofs so efficient. Now you can, for very long vectors, A and B, be able to make a proof that C is the inner product of A and B in O of log n space. Instead of before, the only options were O of n space or something like on that order of poor performance. Oh, and then at the very base case, we have, A prime and B prime are just single scalars, and you send, the single A prime and B prime, and the verifier checks that that's equal to your base case C prime. Cool. So yeah, that's sort of it for the inner product. And then just sort of like as a recap, if you are the prover, now you have received 1 L and 1 R point for every one of these steps. And then you've also received the C prime. So you effectively like reverse this process, and you build up what every higher C is using the L and R from that previous step until you get to the top level C. And if your top level C is equal to the C that you expect, then you're like, wow, this all verifies perfectly. So that is our core building block here. Before I move on, any questions about this? All right. So I did skip some things. So one thing that I skipped is how we actually get the x. I told you don't worry about it because all you need to know is it's not 0 and that it's random. In practice, we use the Fiat-Shamir heuristic to get these challenge scalars. What we actually do is we bind the x to all of the things in the previous round so that you can only get this random x once you've committed to everything before, so you can't actually maliciously choose this x. So that's something that I didn't talk too much about. If you're curious about it, I can explain more. I also didn't talk about how the operations are actually over commitments over the plain values. In all of these examples, I just use the plain A and B, but we actually are operating over additively homomorphic commitments in the exact same way that in our earlier example for a confidential transaction, we're actually operating over additively homomorphic commitments when we check that they add to the same amounts. And then the last one's just a performance thing. We use multi-exponentiation to have faster verification, but that's not fundamental to the math. It's just like cool performance speedups. All right, so we just covered the inner product building block. And now you might be wondering, like, why do we even care? Like, why does it matter that C is the inner product of A and B? Like, whatever. And the reason that it's actually really cool, or why we care about this form, is because we can actually, by applying math and cryptography to a statement, we can represent effectively any statement as an inner product. If you don't believe me, I'll show you with this range proof, and then I can also show you with our generalized constraint system proof, which therefore reduces from any statement. Let's look at the range proof first. So here, what we want to do is we want to start out with this statement of range. 0 is less than or equal to v, which is less than 2 to the n. We want to do some things to it, TBD, until it's in the form of C equals the inner product of A and B, such that if and only if, such that if C is equal to the inner product of A and B, then with very high probability, V is in range. Cool. Is everyone on board with this mission? Any questions so far? All right, so now we're just looking at this in-between math and crypto step. All right, so the first thing that we want to observe is really interesting. So if V is in range from 0 to 2 to the n, then V must be a binary number of length n. So in this example, if V is 3, V is definitely in range between 0 and 2 to the n if n is 4. So you must be able to represent V as a binary number of length 4. Cool. So as a mental exercise, you can try this with any value between 0 and 2 to the 4, and you'll see that, yes, indeed, it does work. And then if you try to represent something larger, so 2 to the 4 plus 1, you'll see that you cannot actually fit everything in these boxes. Cool. So by definition of binary numbers. So I think this is pretty cool, first of all. Any questions so far? Is anyone if you don't follow along with this, you'll be lost for the rest of this explanation, so I want to make sure everyone's on board. Don't be embarrassed. It's it took us at least a month to figure this out, so don't be embarrassed. I'm covering it in 2 minutes. Cool. So we now have a V of 3. This is our secret value, and we want to prove that it's between 0 and 2 to the 4. What we do is we call the binary representation of V A sub L, and this is what the paper uses, so I'm just trying to be consistent. And then we can say that V is the inner product of A sub L and 2 to the n. Remember, inner products can be of any two vectors that are the same length. So here we're actually representing V as an inner product. So maybe some of you are thinking whoa, we've actually jumped from this V in range all the way to an inner product statement. Are we done? I wish. That would be really nice. No, we're not done. And the reason for this is because if this was your only statement, you can actually do something malicious with your A sub L. Does anyone have any guesses as to what you can do with your selection of A sub L that would be malicious, that would allow you to make a value that's outside of the range, but for whom this inner product argument is actually true? Yes, exactly. A sub L, nothing about this statement, V equals the inner product of A sub L and 2 to the n, requires that A sub L is actually just binary. So if you had the last digit or the first digit is 100, then V would be a huge number, but this inner product statement would still be true. So what we want to do, oh, whoops, I actually had slides to walk through all of this. There we go. So here's some examples of V. What we want to do is basically add another statement that A sub L has to be binary. And the way that we do this is we create an A sub R. A sub R is the bits of A sub L minus 1. So if we have 0, 0, 1, 1, then A sub R is -1, -1, 0, 0. So this has a really neat property where if you multiply every bit of A sub L with the corresponding bit of A sub R, then if A sub L is only bits, then you'll get a vector of zeros. If A sub L is anything else, for example, 100, then you'll get 100 times 99, and that's not a 0. So this is actually a statement that makes sure that A sub L is comprised of bits. So now we have 3 statements. One being the vector is actually A sub L times inner product with 2 to the n. The second one being A sub L times A sub R equals zeros. And the third just being the definition of A sub R. Cool. So how's everyone doing? Does this make sense? Why we introduced a sub r? Cool. And obviously, you can combine steps 2 and 3 into just like one statement without defining a sub r. But we tried to do that and then realized that that breaks the protocol because you have to separately make a commitment to a sub r. So just trust me that you actually need to do all 3 of these things. Cool. So now we have come up with these 3 statements where these 3 statements, if they're true, then your original range statement is true. So before moving on, I need to introduce another mathematical building block that allows you to combine statements. So the same way that we got a challenge scalar last time, previously in the inner product proof, here let's just pretend we have a challenge scalar. Let's not worry about how we get it, but it's just random and it's not 0. If a equals 0 and b equals 0, then you can actually combine these 2 statements together into one statement using this random challenge by saying a plus bx equals 0. And as long as x is random, then with extremely high probability, this last statement will be true if and only if a equals 0 and b equals 0. Does this make sense? Let's see. And if you want to be malicious and also check your understanding, can someone tell me what x has to be in order to maliciously make an x such that a plus bx equals 0, even if a and b do not equal 0? 0, yeah, that's true, yes. And also, you can set x as equal to a divided by b. And that would also give you maliciously a way to circumvent this double combination step. So we just have to check that x is not equal to 0 and sample x from such a large space that the probability that it's equal to a divided by b is so small that we don't really worry about it. And in practice, we sample x from 2 to the 255 minus 19, so we're fine. Don't worry about it. Cool. So we can actually do this multiple times. Don't be scared. This is the same idea. We can do this multiple times by, instead of using x once, we can multiply the first one by nothing, the second one by, well, here our challenge scalar is y, by y, our third one by y squared, so on and so forth, and everyone has a different exponent of y. And the reason that we're allowed to do this is because if y is random, then taking y to a certain exponent is also going to give you something that is random in that space. And so the way that we write this combination is the inner product of a and b times the vector of y to the n equals 0. So it's a little bit weird syntax, but that's just how we write it. And so since the prover can't predict y, the latter statement, this inner product of a and b times y to the n equals 0, is true with very high probability. All right, so this is our building block. I'm just showing you how you can use random challenges to combine a bunch of statements together. And hopefully you also have a little inkling of this is interesting because this last statement is actually an inner product statement. So remember how this whole journey is us trying to start with a range proof or a range statement and ending up with an inner product? This is actually a tool that we'll use to get to that inner product. So the way that we'll use this tool is that the verifier gives us a random challenge scalar y. So this comes from somewhere. In practice, it comes from the Fiat-Schumer heuristic. Then we rewrite the second 2 statements because the first statement is already in the inner product proof form. So we're already pretty well along there. But the second 2 statements, we use this y to combine the statements together into inner product forms. So once again, originally, the second statement, a sub l times a sub r equals 0, the vector of zeros, is actually multiple statements. It's n statements, one statement for each index of a sub l and a sub r. And what we actually do is we're combining all of those statements by multiplying each of those statements by a different power of y. And then we're combining them in one inner product argument. So this is just the format that we write it in once we combine it with y. And then we do the same for the second one. Cool. So how are you feeling about that? We use this challenge scalar. Now we do some crazy stuff. End up in 3 inner product arguments. All right. And then we do it again. Now we take a random challenge scalar z. And our arguments, remember how I was saying if a equals 0 and b equals 0, then a plus b times the challenge scalar x equals 0. So we're doing the exact same thing here. Here we have v equals a sub l inner product with 2 to the n, which you can actually rewrite as 0 equals 0 equals a sub L inner product with 2 to the n minus v. And what you do is you just multiply that by z squared, multiply the second thing by z, multiply the third thing by z to the 0, or nothing. And then you end up with this statement. Cool. Now you have one statement. Remember how our goal was to get it in one statement that is one inner product argument. So we're really close. We have one statement that's 3 inner product arguments. And then we do some math that I'm not going to bore you with. That's basically just algebra. You just like take some things apart and rearrange them. And then you end up with this inner product statement equals this thing on the right. So if you're curious about what that math is, we wrote it up here. It's really not, I promise you, it's not actually that interesting. But look here on the right, this is exactly the format that we want. We want an inner product argument where the thing on the left, inner product with the thing on the right, equals C. So we can essentially represent, we can think of the thing before the comma as A, and the thing after the comma as B, and the thing after the equals as C. So to recap, we have, L and R. I forget the letters that I use. But to recap, this is our journey. We started with a range statement. We broke it out into 3 separate statements that must all be true if this range is actually, if the value is actually in range. And then we applied these like random challenge scalars such that we could rearrange all 3 of these into one inner product argument. And that is basically in the same format as what we wanted. T is the inner product of L and R. And going all the way back to the beginning, now that it's in this inner product argument, if and only if this inner product is true, then the V is in range. And we have a really efficient way in O of log n to prove that this inner product is true. Cool, so it comes full circle. Yeah, and then this is L, R, and T of the inner product. So before I move on to how this is actually kind of oversimplifying it, I want to make sure that the simplification makes sense to everyone. Anyone have questions? Questions? Yes? Yes, for sure. So the first part is we took this y, and we took the y to rewrite each of these. So now we have, like, here on the right-hand side, here on the left-hand side, we now have 3 statements, and these 3 statements have to be true. But we want some way to, like, somehow smush all of these 3 statements into one statement. So, like, if we're not looking at all of the, like, annoying math, but we just had 3 statements that are, like, A equals 0, B equals 0, C equals 0, and you wanted to represent that as just one statement, what you can do is you can take, like, a random number, Z in this case, and you can say, if A plus B times Z plus C times Z squared equals 0, then with extremely high probability, we know that all our 3 individual statements, A equals 0, B equals 0, C equals 0, those are all true. So that's exactly what we're doing here. We're multiplying the first thing by Z squared, multiplying the second thing by Z, multiplying the third thing by Z to the 0, or nothing. And then that gives us the equation on the right. And then we just move the V to the end, just because it's prettier that way. Cool, does that answer your question? Okay, I saw one other hand, yeah. Oh man. I was hoping that, you wouldn't notice that. This delta represents all of the messy craziness that we don't actually want to write out. And I think if we go on in the next slides, the same way that in the previous slide I was like, these are things that I'm not diving into even deeper. That's one of the things where delta just represents everything that is like public knowledge. So delta is doesn't have anything that's secret in it. The prover and the verifier both know what's in delta. And that's why we can just abstract it into this delta nice thing, because it doesn't contain anything too important or too secret. Cool, any other questions? All right, so that's actually a good segue into the next section, which is that, as you might notice, A sub L minus Z on the left-hand side of the inner product, if you were to just send that to the prover, if you were to just send that to the verifier would just learn what your A sub L is, and then be like, oh, now I know your secret, haha. So that's like actually sort of silly. And so what we actually do in practice is we make commitments to what's on the left and the right of the inner product. And then really nice, and then also z squared times v. So like these are things that we actually want to make commitments to, and we will send over the commitments instead of sending over the plain secrets. What does that look like? Maybe first I should review what commitments are. So if you have an additively homomorphic commitment, like I mentioned way at the beginning of the talk, then if you have some secrets, a plus b equals c plus d, then your commitments will also maintain the additive property of those secrets. So then the commitment of A plus the commitment of B would be equal to the commitment of C plus the commitment of D. And then similarly, this also extends to multiplication by a scalar. So if you have 2 times E equals F, then 2 times the commitment of E equals the commitment of F. So you don't have to worry about how this works. You can just sort of treat this as a black box. If you do want to learn about how this works, it's really just a Peterson commitment, and it's really straightforward. You're just multiplying by a group element and adding a blinding factor times another group element that's orthogonal. It's not that crazy. I'm also happy to dive into that more. But if you want to treat this as a black box, then basically all you do is you start out with the thing on the left of the inner product, the thing on the right of the inner product, and the thing on the outside, and you just make commitments to them. And if the inner product of those commitments is true, then with extremely high probability, then the secrets inside those commitments are also true. So that's really nice. That's sort of the magic of an additively homomorphic commitment scheme. And in practice, that's what we do. So as a recap, let's see. Yeah, so as a recap, this sort of takes us full circle. We can send over this inner product argument without fearing that we're revealing any secrets. So things that I omitted are how the challenge scalars are generated, how the commitments work in detail. Once again, they're just Peterson commitments. And I also skipped over how the values are blinded. That's part of how the commitments work. So if you want a deeper dive into that, I'm also happy to talk about that, but it's okay just treating it as a black box and being like, yes, that is how it works. So the end result of, we understood the paper, we implemented it, and then these are our end results. Oh, I forgot to include that it's less than 1 millisecond per 64-bit range-proof verification, and that's even without batching. So if you were to batch, you can get multiple verifications in even less time. And so, yeah, that's our numbers. And I think that's all of the material that I had for today. I'm also happy to talk about, how we use this and other ways to abstract, bulletproofs over arbitrary statements instead of only over range proofs. So maybe let's start with some questions. Let's see how I'm doing on time. Let's start with some questions about the actual math part of this talk, and then maybe after that, I'll just take requests for other things that you want to hear about. Any questions about the math? Anything that you missed, I'm happy to review. Yes?
So in the slide where you split A and B, you had, why was it x to the -1 on A, but x to the -1 on B below?
Yes. Great question. So the reason that we do this, well, we meaning really Benedict who wrote the paper, the reason that he does this is because then you have the really cool property where here you actually get the x of the b low to, the x that is x inverse attached to the b low to cancel out the x in a low. So here, let me just review how this works. So if you have the inner product of this with this, what you're actually doing is you're taking this and multiplying it by this, and that gives you a low times b low, or a low inner product with b low. And then here, the x inverse here cancels out with the x here, and that gives you a high inner product with b high. And so that's just a nice sort of math trick. And if we didn't have that canceling out property, we actually wouldn't be able to reconstruct C from C prime. So good question. That is a really cool trick. Cool. Any other questions about math? Yes, hi.
Did you say you had this breakdown online somewhere for those of us who missed them?
Yes, it is at this, sorry, the URL is kind of long, but it's, sorry. I also have these slides online if you want to just review the slides. It's docinternal.dalek.rs/bulletproofs. If you just go to that, you can navigate all of the notes. The distinction between, I'm so sorry, I should make the URL bigger. The distinction between doc internal and doc, like external, just doc, is that the doc.dolloc.rs actually gives you the API and all of the documentation for the API for how to use this, whereas doc internal gives you an internal look of the math. And this is a really nice thing that we have because we made everything in Rust. We have like Rust documentation formatting. Yeah, awesome. Okay, any other questions about the math? And if not, I can take requests for things that you would like to hear about that are sort of above and beyond this. Choices of like what I can talk about. We worked a lot on constraint systems, which is basically how to build an arbitrary statement and then make a proof about it. I can talk about Cloak, which is how we built a confidential assets protocol using all of this. I can talk about ZKVM, which is like our smart contract language that we built on top of all of this. Anyone super excited about any of those things? Yes?
Would you consider Merlin in the scope of what you talk about?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, Merlin's really cool. I might have slides for it, but basically the idea is when you have a paper that says, like, the prover gives something to the verifier. The verifier, like, does this random challenge sampling and then gives a challenge back. In the paper, usually they say, like, this is an interactive coin protocol. We naively, like, obviously just use the Fiat-Shamir heuristic to make this non-interactive. And then as an implementer, you're like, what? Like, how? And so Merlin is basically a strobe-based transcript protocol that Henry made. Henry was one of my colleagues who helped with the Bulletproofs implementation. We were working on, like, how do we make this non-interactive? And he was like, this would be a really good use case for a library that takes care of all of that for you. In practice for papers, when you implement the Fiat-Shamir heuristic, a lot of times people just hash the things that the prover gives to the verifier. You're like, we just hash this, and then we take this challenge from it, and then we use the challenge, such as, sorry, here's an example. If you wanted to take a challenge, like here, for instance, x, like, where does this x come from? And a lot of the time, people just like take, for example, the vector a and hash it, take the vector b and hash it, combine those somehow, and get the challenge x. But this is sort of easy to misuse or easy to get a little bit wrong, and also really complicated if you're doing multiple rounds of this. And so that's why Henry made Merlin, which is effectively a black box where you're like, I put my randomness in here. I don't have to worry about what happens behind the scenes, and I get some randomness back that I have guarantees about that is actually fully random, that is domain separated. You don't have like hash collisions, things like that. So that's actually, and so that's where we get x from. We actually use the Merlin transcript to get the x, to get the y, to get the z for all of these random challenge scalars. Yeah. Anything else? Anyone want to hear about any other things? I can also be done. Tell you more. Okay. I think the coolest thing that we built on top of this is the Cloak protocol. So let me just pull up my slides for that. Sorry. Oop. All right, so I guess maybe to back up, so Bulletproofs is not just a range proof protocol. It's they call it in the paper, they call it a circuit proof protocol as well, where you can take any arbitrary arithmetic circuit and then make a proof that it is correct over some inputs while keeping those inputs secret. It turns out that coding up arithmetic circuits is like a huge pain, and so we actually just changed the representation to a constraint system. They're really easily translatable from one to the next, but constraints are a little bit easier to talk about. So you have a multiplicative constraint, which is you have 3 variables, and you have the additional constraint that x times y equals z for each of those secret variables. And you also have a linear constraint, which is like some linear combination of secret variables with clear text weights. So these are like the tools that you have with which to build up this constraint system. And with a constraint system, you can actually represent anything that is efficiently verifiable. So by this, I mean any NP-complete program can be changed into or represented as a constraint system. So that's pretty nice. Fun side note is that the extension that my colleague Oleg made over this constraint system protocol actually broadens the things that you can represent from NP complete to P space. So like if you're a theory nerd, that's like pretty fun. but if you're not, it doesn't matter. So you can represent basically any program you want as a constraint system. So what we wanted to do was to make a confidential assets protocol. And confidential assets is like a lot harder to make than a confidential transaction protocol because you want to keep the asset types secret. And so like naively, if you're just like, I want to add together all of the sums of all of the different asset types, then you'd have to specify which assets are the same, and that would reveal which assets are which over enough analysis. So you can't just sort of sum together things the same way that you do for confidential transactions with one asset type. So what we came up with was sort of multiple gadgets that we composed together. So on the right-hand side, we have a range gadget. That's what we call it, which is a collection of constraints that basically make sure that the variables in the constraint system are in range. And then we added some new ones. So shuffle gadget is basically a collection of constraints that make sure that the inputs and the outputs are a valid reordering of each other. So you can't just introduce a new input, introduce a new output, then the shuffle gadget would fail. And then there's a merge gadget, which either merges two inputs into one or just moves them without altering. Same with split. Split either splits one item into two, or it moves the two inputs to the two outputs without altering it at all. So I guess before I jump into how this is all assembled, intuitively, if you're dealing with multiple assets and you want to have some way to like prove that your input to this like protocol and your output to this protocol are valid, you want to prove that your inputs have been rearranged in such a way that the asset types are preserved, but without creating or destroying value. So this is really tricky because you can't actually reveal what asset groupings you have. So this is like a fine, like, it took us a while to come up with this solution. But what it was is basically we first, we grouped these gadgets together such that any output reordering is a valid, like actual, transaction output reordering that of the inputs should be able to satisfy this collection of gadgets. Let me walk you through why this is the case, or like how we would actually prove this. So suppose that your inputs are $5, 3 yen, and $4. What you, as the prover, would do, since you have the secrets, you would look at this and be like, okay, well, I know that I have to group all of my assets that are of the same kind together into the same chunks. So you're going to use the shuffle to reorder this such that your dollar amounts are together and your yen is at the very end. Then you will merge your dollar amounts into one lump sum, and you'll merge your yen, well, you won't because you only have one. And then you shuffle it such that your non-zero values are at the very top of the shuffle for each asset type. And then this is the part that's like, hopefully the intuition, is that you'll then split your lump sum into whatever your target amounts are. So here, output target amounts are 3 yen, $6, and $3. So you'll take your $9 and split it into $6 and $3. And the yen you'll leave alone because it's just one output. And then just to preserve the randomness of your output, you'll shuffle it one more time. You'll apply a range check to it to make sure that none of these are negative. And then you get your outputs. And so if your outputs are valid, then you should be able to do this successfully. If your outputs are not valid, suppose that one of your outputs you wanted to make it $100, you would not actually be able to correctly satisfy all of these gadgets. One of these gadgets would be like, wait, where'd this extra money come from? Like, this is not a valid constraint satisfaction. So this is the intuition for how it works. And then for a verifier, the verifier actually only receives these commitments to the inputs and commitments to the outputs. And it can't tell what happened within each of the gadgets because all of these are just blind commitments to the verifier. But all they can do is verify that, yes, indeed, this proof succeeded or this proof failed, and then, valid or invalid transaction. So that's the intuition for Cloak. And I think the important thing to illustrate here is like this is just one of many uses for the Bulletproofs constraint system API that you can come up with. We just sort of made this by hand after figuring out what would make sense as a way to build it. And anyone else can basically make their own protocols and proofs as well. So that's cool. That's my little add-on. I think I'm out of time. Do I have time for questions maybe, or should I just? All right. Any questions about the last bit? Yes.
Can you clarify how the range is used to validate that all the money is there?
Yeah. So here at the very end we have the range check, and so basically the output of the third shuffle right here it's 3 yen, $6, and $3, right? And we just want to add a range check that all of those values are between 0 and 2 to the n for some large n. For example, if we wanted to like maliciously make a $100 output, then we would basically end up with shuffle 3, and we'd want to somehow make like $100 as one of the outputs, and then negative, math is hard, negative 92 something, another negative number, but then that would fail a range check. So basically the range check makes sure that we can't make extra money. Sorry, you can ask me more questions afterwards.
Go, please speak with her if you would like to have any more information about any of the stuff that she was speaking of. We are going to start right away, getting our next presenter up here. It's going to be Kristy-Leigh with talking about kind of mining. So if mining is something that you're interested in, we're getting her right in up here. That's going to be starting very shortly.
Can I give you this?
Yes.
She's going to be speaking with us about mining things, which Monero has, so it's of it is of interest to some of us here. Please, by all means, come in and take a seat. We ask that if you're hanging out in the back, please keep the volume down as a courtesy to those who are trying to listen to the talk. That is greatly appreciated. Any conversations that are in-depth, please take them outside. That, once again, very appreciated as a courtesy to the people that are listening to the talk. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kristy. Let's give her a hand.
Shall we test? Is it working? Testing, testing. There we go. Oh, man. Well, hello, Monero Village. Have you been having a good Defcon? Yes. Good to hear. I have. This year, I've learned how to hack a traffic light, a desktop phone, an airplane, and a voting machine. You know, valuable skills that will serve me well, but don't worry, I don't want your data, I just want your hashes. Speaking of hashes, today I want to talk to you about accessible mining. What is it? Why on earth does it impact Monero? Well, accessible mining is a simple notion. It's the concept that any human being around the world can jump in and start contributing to the cryptocurrency network with no investment required. See, this is really critical when you're starting to bootstrap a network, or especially when a coin is in the lower, in the top 10 currencies and is trying to gain large-scale adoption and large-scale decentralization. That low barrier is critical to mass adoption. The video game industry figured this out quite quickly. That's why a game like Fortnite can have 250 million players versus the 5 million players in a game like World of Warcraft. When you, as a human, have very little risk to try something new, you're more willing to engage. It's instinct, and building a great product is about taking advantage of human instinct. In fact, that's one of the reasons I'm so bullish on blockchain technology in general. It's one of the only industries in the world right now where psychology, economics, infrastructure, hardware, software, and security are so tightly entwined. In other industries, you can remove one of those pillars and you can still have a functioning product. In blockchain, if you remove a single part, it crumbles. Think about it for a moment. So today, some of the things I want to cover are engagement mechanics. How do we engage with cryptocurrency? How do we generate more users through the use of proof-of-work mining? How does that directly contribute to the decentralization and Monero's stated vision and goal? A little bit about the energy consumption, because this is one of the things that you're going to run into a lot as developers when you're talking to outside participants, as well as outside companies, specifically when you tie yourself to a proof-of-work algorithm, regardless of whether it's CPU-based, GPU-based, or ASIC-based. And also RandomX, is it the solution? Does it meet its stated goals of ASIC resistance? A consensus algorithm is key to user engagement. User engagement is how you build a great product and subsequently a great cryptocurrency. While many argue that proof of stake is the future for cryptocurrency scalability, they forget the biggest trade-off. Proof of stake only works in countries where procuring cryptocurrency is seamless, and in networks that have a very mature ecosystem and a very mature user base. Think about a brand new user who has no understanding of cryptocurrency. How likely are they to purchase coins with their hard-earned fiat and start staking? Highly unlikely. The generation mechanics for a coin need to be carefully decided. Remember when we talked about how hardware is... Uh-oh, there we go. See, the hardware you target is critical to user engagement. Many like to argue that dedicated mining hardware increases network security due to skin in the game or other nonsensical statements, but they forget that this only works if the dedicated hardware has widespread adoption, healthy supply chains, and a minimal barrier to entry. An ASIC eliminates the acquisition of users who may have been casual miners with spare GPUs or CPUs, or participants who want to get engaged with minimal investment. But rather than just telling you, let me show you. So this slide comes from Fidelity Mining Summit. It's produced by Nick Carter, a partner at Castle Island Ventures. See, Nick found that there is a strict correlation between when ASICs hit the network publicly, or rather when the Bitmain ASIC started shipping, and when the growth of users and confidence in the network slowed down. We can see the correlation of active wallet addresses. An ASIC manufacturer is going to fiercely deny this whenever you ask them. They're going to talk about how valuable their hardware is, how it aligns incentives, how it creates decentralization. But the reality is that when someone who builds hardware for a single purpose, they will do whatever it takes to ensure that hardware's livelihood is not jeopardized. This creates the wrong incentives of a network participant. It creates the wrong incentives for a privacy coin. Contrast this with the incentives of someone on consumer-grade hardware. Their day-to-day usage of this hardware is most commonly reserved for other use cases. This can be anything from CGI rendering for some of the larger-scale GPU operators to video games and streaming from the home user. Now flip it to CPUs. Most likely, a CPU is going to be tied to a GPU regardless, but you're limited to 1 if you're a home user or have an average device, or 2 if you're a server operator, or 4 if you're just a super badass. Now, I'm always asked all the time by investors or also some of my colleagues, but Kristy, what about those big, scary server farms that Amazon and Microsoft run? What if they come in and take control of the cryptocurrency network? Here's the thing. If there's money to be made in any way, shape, or form, you are going to incentivize participation. This happens on proof of work, happens on proof of stake, proof of authority, every single consensus algorithm. And that's okay. All you want to do is ensure you have set yourself up for success and your coin up for success to get as much user adoption via other means. A participant like Amazon or Microsoft is also only going to use remnant cycles and be what we call a nomadic miner. And I was actually surprised how many people didn't realize there are 2 types of miners, or how little mining game theory is spread around the ecosystem today. So nomadic miners are the kinds of miners that roam from coin-to-coin network, seeking profit. They're not going to engage in your community. They'll not be on Discord. They'll not be commenting on GitHub or even testing a miner. They will sit in a silo and generally switch to whatever is the most profitable. Now, sometimes A nomadic miner will fall in love with the community, a product, or a vision, and transition into what we call a tribalistic miner. By contrast, tribalistic miners stay locked into a network, regardless of the price. These people are big community contributors when it comes to security, optimizations, applications, and spreading awareness. Even during the bear market, there were a subset of miners that stayed locked into both the Monero network, the Ethereum network, and even the Litecoin network. Even today, with the Litecoin halving, there is still double the net hash compared to what was at the start of the year. It is a coin network's responsibility to do whatever it takes to capture as many tribalistic miners as possible. Much like the VCs of the traditional era, a tribalistic miner has to be sold on some part of your strategy, whether it's the vision, the team, the product, the community, or the code. Now, a majority of coins win their user base by converting these nomadic miners to tribalistic miners. The only way to do this without massive marketing budgets is that gamble on your coin because they believe in the future of strategy, or simply when moon. But those filthy miners contribute to the heat death of the universe. Now, surprisingly, I also deal with this statement a lot, pretty much every second day, whether it comes from new interns, new participants, clients, and, well, generally this is how I'm answering it. Yes, there is 7.67 gigawatts of energy currently consumed by the Bitcoin network right now, to which you should calmly point out that the banking system right now consumes 3 times this. Now, if you're going to try and build a global financial ecosystem, yes, power consumption is probably going to be involved. Actually, if you're going to do any kind of computing system, power is going to be involved. But zoom out on the big picture. See, we've got to put it into comparison. Bitcoin right now only represents 0.25% of the total electricity production in the world. It consumes less than 0.29% of the total electricity in the world. Now, right now, the amount of electricity that we could produce for the Bitcoin network could power it 66 times with hydro, 9 times with biofuels and waste, 22 times with solar, wind, and gas. See, cryptocurrency mining is the only activity right now in the world that can turn wasted energy into cash. Funny thing about biofuels, funny thing about gas and solar and wind. Harnessing that energy and storing it is actually incredibly expensive and a bit of a specialty. And that stability of this energy also isn't suitable for any sort of HPC work, AI work, whatever you can think. If you run out of juice halfway through training your model, you're fucked. That creates incredibly powerful incentives with participants in the ecosystem right now if we think about this on a bigger scale. Take Bitcoin out of the picture. So when I joined Core Scientific, I started thinking seriously about this problem. There was idle energy all around the world. New coins couldn't get hash power or had trouble getting these tribalistic miners. And centralized mining was kind of wreaking havoc on the industry. See, there's nothing I can do to help the Bitcoin network simply because of how the SHA-256D algorithm is designed. Any sort of consumer device will not catch up to this dedicated hardware. So 2 things happened during this thought session. One was that I happened to stumble upon a report from the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. They did a study on home idle load in America. Basically, how many devices were wasting energy, and they found that always on but inactive devices are costing Americans $19 billion annually. So these are devices like your TV that are consuming energy all around the world, but while they're inactive. See, doing board bring up and bring down mechanics on devices is actually incredibly complex. A lot of the manufacturers still skimp in the industry, and it's just not advanced there right now. So there's always power leakage. This is a fact of the embedded hardware ecosystem. So these were things like fish ponds, they found, consumed a ton of energy. Hot water reduction pumps, set-top boxes, fans. So I filed this away in my brain and I thought, wouldn't it be cool to mine with an aquarium or a television? And then my boss told me to go do some real work. And I largely forgot about it until Project Palladium hit. For those of you who heard my talk at Defcon, Project Palladium was a initiative we launched with a company called Astral AR about making drones that stop bullets be able to mine cryptocurrency so they can pay back for their OPEX while they're idle. These drones spend about 22 hours life cycle per day just idle. Now, Project Palladium couldn't have worked without a targeted mining algorithm like RandomX that was dedicated to the cause of this one-to-one user distribution. The economics wouldn't have worked, they would never have gotten funded, the hardware would never have been rolled out. All of a sudden, through this one simple act of choosing the right mining algorithm, we managed to convert a whole new generation of people to start thinking about cryptocurrency and expose them to Monero of all coins. And of course, my personal enjoyment is the fact that, hey, it's also government hardware. See, that's the important thing to understand. Your algorithm is just one piece of the decentralization puzzle. It's also about how many users can you get adopted and locked into your network. How many of these users can you convert into tribalistic miners? Enter RandomX. So RandomX had a vision. CPUs, one-to-one, as close to Satoshi Nakamoto's vision as possible. There's a little bit of a problem with that. RandomX is targeted towards devices that consume 4 gigabytes worth of memory. Now, this might be great for a home desktop, but the reality is that most home desktops aren't going to actively be engaged in mining. Most of the participants in the mining ecosystem now do not have a home desktop. They more have a cell phone or some sort of handheld device. They have a gaming device. Not all of this equipment actually has sufficient memory. For Project Palladium, we're okay. The Edna drone can have up to 16 gigabytes of DDR3 on board, thanks to its internal architecture. So we personally don't have any problems with that project. But I've started to realize that as we've started to talk to more participants in Core Scientific and hype has started to spread, we wanted to start rolling this out to other devices. We've engaged with a large number of companies, some of which I wish I could talk about today, but I'll have to wait for a few weeks, that all are starting to see the benefits of proof-of-work mining. See, RandomX's memory requirement again. The average memory available for an embedded device is going to be 256 megabytes, just. Now, while the CPU target is great and perfect, the memory requirement only benefits the hardware with ample memory requirements, such as cameras. Surprisingly, what I found, a majority of the facial recognition cameras in places such as China, some of the Asia continents, also Germany, this is the perfect target for RandomX. And then I start thinking, is that really the user participants you want on your network? Because that's what you're going to attract. See, that's the clever thing about designing consensus mechanisms. This subtle change tweaks the user base that you're going to attract. Now, the future of mining belongs to mass consumer hardware. I know this to be true. I've lived through this space for 10 years. I've watched us go from CPUs to GPUs to ASICs, and I'm starting to see that there is this trend and this surge of mass consumer hardware coming back. And it's going to come in the form of embedded devices. Why? Again, it is those incentives. It's that engagement mechanic. Let's just go through a little exercise for a moment. Imagine collecting the data from your fridge, tokenizing it, and storing it on the Monero blockchain while it's mining. So Amazon's going to pay you for that data, just a tiny amount, one-time access. Why would they do that? Well, imagine the light bulb in your fridge goes out. And I just learned that not all American fridges have light bulbs, so maybe this thought experiment doesn't work for you, but humor me. Now, all of a sudden, Amazon, who has paid you for an active subscription to the machine telemetry from your fridge, sends you an alert. They have gotten first chance to send you a advertisement. They say, hey, your light bulb is out. Here is a special deal for light bulbs right now, only 99 cents. Take it a step further. Imagine you have a subscription service where the moment your machine reports a failure and it goes up to the chain, replacement parts are issued. See, your blockchain tells Amazon the light bulb is out. Amazon orders and sends you that light bulb automatically, and then starts using your fridge's mining revenue to pay back for the cost of the light bulb. You get a notification on your phone to replace the light bulb. Take it a final step further. Imagine you want to buy a fridge. You can see a historical report on the Monero chain of how many light bulb replacements this fridge has needed over the years of operation, how many times it's needed service, how often it has overheated, all of this data recorded, becoming the Carfax of the mining ecosystem. See, these things are already in actively being built behind the scenes. That small little tweak to your proof of work algorithm has changed the kinds of users that you're starting to engage now. And again, that ability to monetize remnant hardware cycles is a powerful, powerful step forward right now. See, I'm quite bullish on Monero right now. I believe by the end of the year, Monero is going to have at least 2x the user adoption of Ethereum, simply because of the amount of devices that are going to be locked into the ecosystem. These devices will not chain hop. These devices will be dedicated, contributing steady hash power. And what's going to end up happening is a flywheel. This always happens with mining networks. We've seen it a little bit with Bitcoin, where you can correlate the net hash drops to actually the price. See, when you have steady hash rate and steady user engagement, and steady sell and buy orders, your market price stays consistent. This attracts a lot more investment, a lot more, confidence in the network, so on and so forth. And here's the really cool part of this. People that suddenly didn't understand what the hell Monero is start looking for ways where they can actually spend it, ways where they can start using that currency. They don't need to understand what the currency's vision is. All they need to know is, how do I turn this digital asset into an actionable piece of data, or an actionable piece of item. And so I would urge the communities to start thinking a little bit about making some tweaks to RandomX. That small target of 4 gigabytes is going to end up incentivizing the wrong kind of participants, at least I believe. But hey, who knows? I could also be wrong. So if you have any questions about RandomX, or if you have any questions about Monero in general, or about the proof of work algorithm, or about what Core Scientific is working on, feel free to ask me. Thank you very much. We actually have 5 minutes for questions, if anyone does have any questions.
How do you envision the mining being organized pool-wise? Do you see that being more like requiring a peer-to-peer pool, or is it like, oh, all Samsung fridges are going into Samsung's pool, and we then have to convince them to pay out, or is it done algorithmically, or how would you see it?
So with Project Palladium, there was a research paper done together with Monero Research Labs over an algorithm to enforce peer-to-peer. There's also been some research specifically with Monero about rehauling how pools work. My answer is simply, we would engage the Monero community and figure out, how do we actually make sure that we do not swarm a pool and centralize that hash rate. That is something that I would have to spend a lot of time thinking and researching. When we've talked to manufacturers, most of them are okay. They don't really care where the device is mining to, as long as it's consistent revenue in some shape or form, and as long as they can ensure that they have auditability, or they can track, hey, if I sent 3 shares to the pool, did I get paid for 3 shares? So my answer is, I would hope it would be more peer-to-peer based. Otherwise, the other way is just going to go back to Bitcoin mining centralization. The other way we could play this is by having an algorithm which distributes a percentage of the hash rate to different pools. So say you have 100 mining fridges, you allocate 25 to pool X, 25 to pool Y, and so on and so forth. That's also another way to play it. You went.
Does that mean mining is going to become easier for Monero? Because I know that you need quite a bit of, computer power and RAM storage and everything to be able to mine Monero today. So how are fridges and stuff with that power?
So pretty much anything that has some sort of graphical screen, like some of the smart fridges or smart TVs, you'd be surprised about the amount of memory they cram in there today. So most of the top-of-the-line Samsung smart TVs actually have 4 gigabytes, same with fridges. Now, that also locks out a lot of other consumers. I talked about incentive mechanics before. Here's what I envision, and I've seen it play out a few times. If all of a sudden a company like Samsung gets a great deal where they can suddenly take $10 off all of their hardware and have it paid back, or they can give $10 in loyalty points to the consumer, that is a one-up they have over their competitors at Sony. Then Sony is going to be incentivized to go and purchase memory and upgrade their new TV to 4 gigabyte to take advantage of this. We saw this actually happening in 2017 with the great mining crypto rush when it came to memory prices. So, which was crazy. And I lived through that, and I lived through a lot of the projects as well. And that taught me a lot about how manufacturers get directly tied to proof of work incentives, even though none of them will admit it. So that's what I envision is going to happen there. Now for the home user, it is going to get easier. See, there are currently both FPGAs and ASICs on the existing Monero network. I keep a close eye on what is happening in the hardware ecosystem. A few of the participants here also know of my involvement in the original Monero ASICs. So RandomX is going to knock off ASICs entirely. I am pleasantly surprised, aside from the fact that Monero has one sort of vulnerability where you can offload a portion of it to the ASIC and bypass the JIT. Other than that, Monero is actually pretty bulletproof, meaning I could do an FPGA bit stream for it right now, and it would be only about 1.3x more performant. On a GPU, you're going to get about the same performance right now with some optimization tricks in the newest gen, so it's going to be fairly egalitarian. So very exciting.
Yes, my question is if you're dealing with consumer devices, who controls the device? One of the concerns with this decentralization that I can see here is if the device is under the control of the consumer, then you really have true decentralization. If it's controlled by a manufacturer, and in particular, this is very critical in the United States, if it's controlled by a manufacturer that's implemented digital rights management, DRM, then that actually could that not lead to a very high degree of centralization?
Exactly. So here's the interesting part of that. For a bigger company based in the US, they're going to be required to be entirely hands-off, meaning they're going to have to give the user the option to opt in to this service, and then it's entirely left into the hands of the user, meaning that they control the wallet, they control the private keys. Now, when it's a company outside of the US, most of them are going to be more incentivized to actually directly control the mining, directly control the rewards. Unfortunately, I don't know of a good way to stop that, aside from not doing it. And when you are working with a larger company, you naturally are incentivized to do whatever makes the company money. So it is a way up. Now, the way to flip this around is to directly tie it to loyalty points or reward points, where the mining rewards are abstracted. In a country like in India, where mining is actually illegal right now, and cryptocurrency is a bit sketchy, having the ability to directly convert the mined Monero into fiat without and passing that on to the owner of the hardware, or to the or in the form of loyalty points or reward points if you're on a gaming system, etc., might be the appropriate way to go about that. Anyone else? Yep.
Just because of the large interest from the ASIC developers, I know they've manipulated and tried to work with some of the algorithms and developers and groups in the past to keep things advantageous for them. From my understanding, Core is looking to kind of be the Microsoft of the blockchain with information. How are you finding teams and the different groups? How are they receiving your advice about the industry?
Most of the dev groups have, in the blockchain ecosystem as the whole, they don't pay attention to us, and that's okay. All I can do is put out the messages. I can't exactly comment on what Core Scientific's vision is for the blockchain space yet, but we do intend to keep providing infrastructure and backbone services. And one of the things that's very interesting to realize now is that most of the ASIC manufacturers have started to change their tune in a lot of the developments they are doing now. So ASIC manufacturers right now are spending significant resources in investing in both FPGA and GPU technology. We've seen this with the Grin ASICs from InnoSilicon, which are essentially just GPUs. We're seeing this with Bitmain and their FPGAs they're currently building. And we're starting to see this with Daiyun and a lot of the other Chinese manufacturers and the resurgence of FPGA technology. So their incentives are going to be closely tied to RandomX, and that's something that we need to watch out for, because as you have more participants in the network and more hardware engineers, more tricks are likely to be uncovered. All right, that's it, guys. If you have any other questions about incentives, mining, or anything to do with proof of work, let me know.
Thank you very much, Kristy, for giving us. Thank you very much, Kristy, for giving us our last talk of Defcon 2019. Let's give her another hand. For those of you that are still here, you might not want to go anywhere because we are having one final Plinko thing going on over here. So Doug is going to be passing out the tickets. The winner will have a chance to win some Monero. If you don't own any Monero, you have a chance to win some Monero. So over here, Doug, go ahead and raise your hand. They're passing out tickets. Oh, there he is. He's right back there. If you want to take part in this, grab a ticket.